Well, hi. So now I'm going to review my second game from the 45-45 League. And, well, in this game, my opponent is called Sonata 2, who I've played a few times before, and we generally always have interesting games. Particularly this one and the previous one, I think, were especially interesting. So in this game, I had black, and the game went d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight c3, bishop b4, f3. Last time we played, he played knight f3, and we played a queen's Indian, and the game was eventually drawn after many misadventures. But quickly looking at his games, his main line is definitely allowing the Nimzo Indian and then playing 4f3, which is quite a sharp line, and it's quite a modern line. It was played a bit in the sort of 60s and 70s, and then sort of faded into obscurity for a little bit, and then was sort of revitalized and brought back into the limelight by players such as Anand in the 2000s. And the idea is quite simple. First of all, the e4 square is often a very important square for both sides to fight for control of in the Nimzo Indian and Queen's Indian defenses, but more specifically, White's just intending to play e4 and set up a big pawn center. So I played the move d5, which is sort of the quote-unquote solid line. Nowadays, the most trendy move is c5, inviting kind of a Benoni structure where black often has counterplay based on the break b5. And that leads to quite sharp and interesting positions, but nowadays I've been preferring the quote-unquote solid move d5. And I say it's the solid line, but positions in this line tend to get quite weird. And, well, this game sort of shows that excitement can definitely arise from even the solid line of the f3 variation. So, obviously, black is just preventing white, or at least delaying him, from playing the move e2 to e4. It's got one drawback, though, and now that white plays the move a3, as he sort of almost invariably does. And the idea is, after bishop takes c3, b takes c3, white's got the bishop pair. And contrary to the sort of traditional samish variations where white plays a3 on move 4, and his pawns get doubled and often become weak, and nowadays black avoids playing d5 altogether in these variations. In this position, black's already committed to d5, so his double pawns are unlikely to become a problem because white can, at the moment of his choosing, play c takes d5 and eliminate one of them. People have also played bishop e7 here. I think this is a playable line, allowing white to play e4, but with the intention of striking back at the center, often with the move e5, and then going for control over the dark squares with bishop c5. This is definitely a playable line, but I think white's got a small advantage because of his nice control over the center. So, anyways, I played in the game bishop takes c3, which is also the main line. He played b takes c3, and I played c5, so still following the main line. C5 is actually quite an important move. People also play c6 here. That's scored reasonably well. But people sort of know not to play castles here. And the reason was shown, it's been known since this Avro game between, I think it was Botvinnik and Capablanca in 1938, where white took on d5, and after e takes d5, got what's now considered to be quite a favorable pawn structure for white, because he can continue with e3, bishop d3, knight e2, and short castles, and basically just carry out this plan of pushing e4 at his leisure, and black often lacks meaningful counterplay. Whereas if he tries to take with the knight, white can push with e4, despite the fact that the c3 pawn is optically en prise, because after queen b3 the knight's a bit stuck. And after queen takes d4, bishop to b2, queen e3 check, bishop e2, the knight remains stuck. And after, you can continue trying to rescue it with knight d5, but after queen takes e3, knight takes e3, king f2, the knight's ultimately stuck and you have to give it up for 3 pawns, but this ending has been known to favor white. So anyways, that's just the point of that sort of aside, is that at this particular moment c5 is a more important move than castles, because after c takes d5 you can play knight takes d5, and white does not have the option to play e4, because after knight takes c3, queen b3, you can just cover this knight with c takes d4 and black's basically 2 clean pawns up for the time being. E takes e5 is still playable, even though I mentioned the structure is supposed to be better for white. Magnus Carlsen played in the, I think, 2013 match against Anand, where he continued with c4 just to not allow white's bishop to come to d3 ever. It's an interesting line. Carlsen, of course, famously ended up winning that game, and that was his put him up 3-0 in the match, quite late in it. But it is still quite a risky line. So anyways, knight takes d5 is considered to be the most solid move. That's what I played in the game. I did prepare this line a little bit before the game, but I've also, despite actually never having this line in a classical over-the-board game, I've played it a few times in Internet League games, but also my friend plays the 4f3 Nimzo Indian with white, and we've played probably hundreds of blitz games in the f3 Nimzo, a bunch of them being with this line. So I wouldn't say I fully understand the positions because they are quite weird, but I do have a decent amount of at least blitz experience in them. And, well, the thing about this, again, despite this being the more solid of the two options back on move 4, both sides tend to have to make some sort of atypical moves, some paradoxical moves, several moves in a row. And sort of the first moment for that is actually here, where overwhelmingly the main move is d takes c5, which is indeed what my opponent played in the game. And, well, it looks like white's just voluntarily mangling his queenside pawns. But yeah, there are some points to this line. First of all, well, white is eliminating the d5 pawn, the c5 pawn, and he's planning to go e4 next. So he doesn't have to worry about knight takes c3 and c takes d4 anymore. But also, white's a pawn up. It turns out to not be so easy to win back this c5 pawn in a convenient way, and black has to expend a lot of resources to actually pick up this pawn. And in the meantime, white can grab the center and try to arrange his kingside pieces in a sensible way. Now, the other thing is, this pawn on c3, and to a lesser extent this pawn on a3, black can basically pick up the pawn on c3 sort of at his will, but the thing is, it's not always such a good idea to take the pawn on c3. For example, if you do it with the knight, your knight often gets trapped. If you do it with your queen, the queen doesn't usually get trapped, but it does cost black a lot of time to take this pawn with his queen, and at the same time, it actually opens up files and diagonals for white's pieces. So this c3 pawn is often not the pawn black wants to take. However, the pawn on c5 sort of exhibits a bit of a cramping force on black's queen side. So if black regains his pawn, he really wants the c5 pawn to be the one that he regains. Therefore, the main move is queen a5, going after this pawn, and not necessarily after this pawn. He played e4. Again, we're still following the main line of this variation. I played knight f6. Knight e7 and knight c7 are also quite playable. But the idea of this knight f6 move, I like it. It's quite simple. He just wants to go knight f d7 and regain this pawn. Because, okay, you're threatening to regain it with the queen, but white's going to play bishop e3. Most likely. He did in this game. Once again, taking the pawn on c3 is not usually such a good idea because white plays king f2, and the king is actually quite safe on f2, which is another one of these sort of paradoxical points of this f3 variation. And black ends up spending a lot of time with his queen. White manages to consolidate the important c5 pawn and opens, say, the c file for the rook. You might gain a tempo with the knight coming to e2, and so on and so forth. So black castles, and here my opponent played the move knight e2, which is sort of the first deviation from the quote-unquote main line of quote-unquote theory. Just to illustrate some of the strange things that can go on in this line, the main move and the critical try is considered to be queen b3, although king f2 is also quite a popular move. So queen b3, and here the main move is knight f to d7, which I mentioned already. And it's actually quite important to use this knight to regain the pawn and not the other knight, which is, again, another strange point. You don't want to develop a new piece, but rather you want to keep this piece here and use the other knight, move it for the the fourth time, and then possibly the fifth time to get this pawn back. But the idea is that if you play, say, knight a6 or knight bd7, then white gets to play c6, and if black has to regain the pawn by playing b7 takes c6, that's not always such an ideal option, because one of the main pluses of black's position is his better pawn structure. So if he has to admit to a concession and mangle his own pawn, sort of in a mirrored formation to white's, all else being equal, the bishop pair is likely to be quite strong. So it's quite important that black leaves his structure intact, which is why the b8 knight stays on b8 to keep watch over the c6 square, and the other knight comes around to d7 to come and regain this pawn. So anyways, my opponent played knight e2 in the game, but okay, just to show you the main line of this variation, goes knight fd7, and now not queen b4, which would look natural, but black just played queen c7 back, and then starts to harass the queen with knight c6. And even if you're unable to regain this pawn, it's often a very good idea to play b6, and just sacrifice a pawn, and after c takes b6, a takes b6, black's got nice open lines for his pieces, and he's got a lot of compensation, if not just winning his pawn back by force eventually. So the move is a4, and now not knight takes c5, because after knight takes c5, white can play queen b4. And once again, black's forced to play queen takes b4, c takes b4, and now white has fixed his pawn structure, and therefore, even though he had to give his pawn back, now he's basically got the two bishops advantage for free, and should be better in this endgame. So black needs to defer taking on c5 and plays queen to c7 back. Now he is genuinely threatening to take this pawn, but now white shows the point of his previous move and plays queen to a3. Which is not a usual observation post for the queen, but it defends the c5 pawn in a square that is not easy for black to harass. And now if black plays knight a6 to keep up the pressure, white can probably take on a6. Therefore, black goes for the idea I mentioned before and just sacrifices the pawn by playing b6. And after c takes b6, a takes b6, black's got very good counterplay, and in fact should probably win this a4 pawn by force, with something like bishop a6 takes, knight takes a6, knight a to c5, rook to a5, rook f to a8, queen to c6, and taking the pawn. Therefore, white usually declines this pawn and gives it back with a5, and after b takes c5, black's intending bishop a6, so white goes a6 himself, black goes c4. Some very strange line continue. At the end of the day, it is equal, but both sides, once again, have to navigate some very weird complications to reach the, eventual draw. But that's quite an interesting line. Anyways, in the game, my opponent played knight e2, which is a very natural move. Develops a piece, defends the c3 pawn that was attacked with check. But this move is actually not ideal for white. First of all, it doesn't particularly do anything towards the preservation of the c5 pawn. And like I mentioned before, it's the c5 pawn rather than the c3 pawn that's genuinely important for white to protect. But also, the knight on e2 blocks the bishop on f1, which is significant in a couple respects. First of all, if white is trying to get his king castled, obviously he has to develop his bishop on f1 first, before his king can get to safety. But I mean, that's not always such a big deal because, like I mentioned before, the king often finds itself reasonably safe on f2. At least when, all the other pieces are sort of huddled around it. But possibly more significant is the fact that this bishop doesn't control this diagonal, at least for the time being. Because, well, okay, so I played the move knight fd7, just continuing the plan. There are some lines where white's playing rook b1 and he's intending to meet knight takes c5 with rook b5. Supported by the bishop on f1, and sometimes his rook even finds itself swinging over to g5 to participate in a kingside attack. And also, it's somewhat easier for black to play the move knight a6 to try to regain this pawn, because he doesn't have to worry about bishop takes a6, because this bishop's diagonal is blocked. So knight e2 looks like one of the most natural moves in the world, but in fact, the knight often doesn't belong on e2 in this position, and often goes to h3 to keep this bishop's diagonal open. So okay, knight e2 was played. Like I said, I played knight fd7, and he played the move king f2, which I think is a reasonable move because, like I said, this king side is a bit jammed up. So to get the king to safety, it makes a lot of sense to park it on f2. If he plays queen to b3, once again, I don't think you should play... actually, this is another... I think maybe you can play knight takes c5 here, actually, because... you don't have to worry about queen b4 because of knight d3 check. And, well, yeah, this occurs to me as another drawback of having the knight here. The bishop doesn't have control over d3. But I was going to say you could also play queen to c7. And, for example, if queen b4 now, then knight a6, and there's no bishop takes a6. Okay, therefore, just giving up on this pawn and playing king f2 makes sense. But I think black should now be quite fine because he's regained his pawn, and now he's got definitely the superior structure, and he just has to get his queen side out, and he's got a perfectly fine game. White isn't worse at this stage, I don't think, because he still has the bishop pair, and the bishop pair should provide sufficient compensation for the structural defects. And again, black still has to make a couple moves before he gets his queenside into action, but the same can go for white's kingside, and also white's got a little more space. But here white played a move that I thought was a bit strange. He played the move bishop takes c5. And bishop takes c5 is kind of a weird move because it gives up one of white's main advantages, which is the bishop pair. But in addition to that, it also makes white's king more vulnerable because the king was quite safe on f2 with the bishop on e3 still on the board because you can't really get at the king. The only avenue you can really get at white's king by is pushing f5. But that's obviously generally quite risky, as we'll see later in the game, but no spoilers yet. So, but by giving up this bishop, you are opening up this a7 g1 diagonal as an avenue to attack the white king. Now this check already looks moderately scary, but white of course is intending to just play queen d4 and block it. But yeah, white's king is a bit less safe than it was before, and also white doesn't have the bishop pair anymore, so I think now black should be somewhat better. Probably even queen takes d4, c takes d4 is okay for black. You got this kind of typical Grunfeld semi-Tarrasch sort of ending. But obviously black doesn't want to fix the white pawns if he can help it. So I played queen a5. I was also considering playing queen e7. Queen c7 is also possible. The computer rates all these moves as about equivalent. Anyways, I thought it was sort of useful just to keep an eye on these two isolated pawns here while maintaining control over the d8 square so as to play rook to d8 at some stage. For example, rook d1, well, rook d1 I think you can take on a3, but also you can play knight c6 followed by rook d8 to challenge for the open d file. And black's next move is probably going to be one of knight c6, rook d8, maybe bishop d7, maybe b6, maybe e5, but probably rook d8 or knight c6 simply. White played the move queen b4, which I'd actually missed. It's a little bit annoying. Obviously queen takes b4 is sort of off the table, so I went queen back to c7. And here, well, white's queen is still on a bit of a strange square, and black is still in a position to gain a tempo off it by playing knight c6 at some point. So white played the move knight d4. Another move I was considering that I think is quite natural is rook to d1. Well, now that the queen's not on a5, looking at the a3 pawn anymore, this move is possible. And probably knight c6 is quite okay. I think I was... Well, there are some cases where the queen can move to the c file and this pin can be somewhat annoying and sort of disrupts black's natural flow of development. I don't think it particularly works in this case, because if you go to c4, queen b6 check is quite annoying. White doesn't have a terribly convenient answer to this check. Whereas if you go to c5, I think black can probably just play b6 to annoy the queen and play a move that furthers his development. But also I think rook d8 is okay, and none of the back rank tricks really work. Like queen c5, queen takes c5 is check, and even if it weren't check, you would still have this queen block on f8. While on queen c4, I think you just have, again, queen b6 check, and white doesn't have a really great answer to that move, because if you stick a piece on d4, black just has e5 pinning and winning. So yeah, that I think is quite solid for black. In the game, white played knight d4. And here, once again, I thought it was a little bit annoying. Knight c6, I thought white might be able to play a move like queen c5, or maybe queen c4. And yeah, you don't really, once again, want to allow knight c6 and knight takes c6 in such a capacity where you'll eventually have to play b takes c6, because that sort of makes black's structure comparable to white's, and then the game is probably about equal. So you'd probably play bishop d7, but again, this looks sort of a little bit weird. At some point, you have to get out of the pin. Maybe knight b5 is good at some point, maybe bishop b5. It's all just a little bit awkward, so I didn't want to do that, even if it probably is still okay objectively. But I played e5, which I think is a good move, because it gives black some space in the center, it frees this bishop to come out, and there's not really a very good square for the knight to go to. First of all, if you go to f5, I think after bishop takes f5, e takes f5, black's doing great. Knight goes to c6. The rooks come to the open files somewhere. White's structure is now actually even worse than it was before, and maybe at some point you can even play e4 to sacrifice a pawn and clear lines. And white's king, I think, is quite vulnerable, and he still has yet to connect his rooks. Okay, therefore knight f5 I don't think is so good. Knight b5, I think you just go queen b6 check. And the knight on b5 really isn't great because it doesn't have any particular squares to go to. Like, its only benefit really was that it came with tempo. And black just gained the tempo back by moving the queen away with check. Knight c6 can come next, and the white king is just in serious danger. Therefore he played probably the best move, knight to c2. And, well, the idea is, first of all, this knight can come to e3, which does a good job of shielding the king on this diagonal. From e3, as we'll see in the game, the knight can eventually come to d5, which is quite a decent square now that the e6 pawn has, now that the e pawn has abandoned the e6 square. It also covers the rook on a1, which is a bit abstract, but might become relevant in some random line where black tries to go queen b2 somehow. So knight c2 I think is a sensible move. And here I played the move knight a6. I think I said in the spectator chat something to the effect of, alright, now it's time to make a weird decision. And the reason why I played knight a6 is that I thought after bishop takes a6, b takes a6, I would have quite good play along the open b and d files, and that the ruining my structure would be worth it for the open lines and for control over the light squares. I don't think this was completely wrong. Like, black's not worse after playing knight a6, but there are probably better moves. The simplest of these is just knight to c6, which is what I was intending initially. And should just give black a stable and simple advantage. Queen b2, you can just play bishop e6, for example, and once again, white doesn't have any particular compensation for his slightly weak c and a pawns and his slightly weaker king. But okay, I thought knight a6 was interesting. And, well, the idea is if you don't take on a6, you don't really have a terribly convenient move with the queen. And the knight can come to c5 next, which is quite a good square, I think. There are some ideas like bishop e6, knight b3, or knight a4 to attack the c3 pawn. Maybe even knight e6, knight f4, but that seems like quite a stretch. And also it keeps the c file open, whereas contrary to knight c6, like for example after queen b2, you might have queen c5 check, for example. I haven't actually computer checked what the best move after queen b2 is, but yeah, I think knight c5 is good. I think lots of stuff is good. f5 is good as well. And black's got a great position. In the game, my opponent played queen c4, which isn't a good move, but bishop takes a6, I was really expecting, and it must be the critical test of black's idea. My opponent decided he didn't want to give up the light squares and open the b file for the rook. So after bishop takes a6, b takes a6. Let's see what happens. First of all, if a move like rook hd1 is played, and rook hd1 is quite a natural move because white's trying to castle by hand, bring the rook over to this side, bring the king back, and bring the king over to h1, and then there's probably not any particular reason why white's king is less safe than black's. But the idea is to play rook b8 to harass the queen, which already doesn't have that many good squares. And what I was thinking in my head was that white would play queen a4, queen c5 check, king f1, and now something like bishop e6, bishop c4, combined with maybe rook b2, and white's king is in great danger, which is probably true. But what I'd missed was that after rook b8, white can play queen to d6, which I don't remember whether I'd missed that this move was possible, or missed that the d6 square was covered now, or I thought I could play queen takes c3 somehow and just forgot that my rook on b8 is going to be hanging, or I was planning something like takes and rook b2. I don't quite remember, but this isn't that great for black. White can also play probably rook a b1 just to try to challenge the open b file and not allow black to play rook b8 straight away. But here, once again, black has quite smooth development, and he can play bishop e6 first, and after a move like knight e3, there's rook a b8. And again, there are some questions to be asked with this queen, because it really doesn't have many convenient squares. In fact, the only one is probably a4. And now black has to take on c3, and like you can win the pawn back on a6, but there's some dangerous checks on d2 or b2. Well, in fact, the check on d2 can probably be met by queen e2 in this instance, but maybe rook b2 check is a stronger move, or just rook f to d8. I think this is indeed dangerous for white, sorry. But there's also the move knight e3, not touching either of the rooks yet, which I think I considered a little bit, but the point that I'd missed was that after the immediate rook to b8, white doesn't have to move the queen and just allow rook b2 check, which would be quite dangerous. But he has the move knight d5, which is really the only move for white, but it's quite good because white is just bringing his knight into a nice square. If rook takes b4, white gets to take back the queen on c7. This is pointed out by the computer, and well, I think the only move is rook takes b4, right? Yeah, there's nowhere to put the queen that doesn't hang something. So this allows white to trade off into some sort of ending where his king probably won't be in that much danger, and black's pawns are equally as isolated as white's pawns. Therefore, maybe bishop e6 is a better move, but even still, here you can play c4, and probably white's position is not too much worse, because after rook a to b8, white now has to move queen b3, and you don't have easy access into white's king position anymore, because the second rank is quite well covered, the diagonal is blocked, and yeah, black's pawns are double and isolated, white's pawns are isolated, and white should not be doing so badly here. There's some ideas, like computer points out this line with g6 and f5, which is interesting, but basically black's given up his structural advantage, and essentially his only plus is maybe slightly more active pieces, you could argue, but his only plus is the slightly weaker white king, which if white manages to get it back to g1 and h1, even at the cost of some time, if he manages to do that while keeping his position intact, then he's not really badly off at all. So anyways, all this to say that knight a6 is a little bit inaccurate because I sort of misjudged the consequences of bishop takes a6, b takes a6. It's not as good for me as I thought it was, and in general this c4 move is one that I sort of underestimated over the course of the game. He played queen c4 instead, which was a surprise to me. First of all, I thought this move just straight up wasn't possible, and I played queen b6 quite quickly. But, well, the problem is this move, it's not horrible, but it's based on an oversight. And the oversight was, well, I thought white has to move the king, and if he has to move the king, he's in deep trouble. Because, obviously, there's no king g1. King g3, yeah. King e2, yeah. And if king e1, well, then the king is much farther away from safety over here, and it's going to be stuck in the center for quite some time, and you can make moves like, I don't know what concrete sequence I saw, but you can bring the bishop out, you can bring the queen to b2 if you want, bring the rooks to the open files, and white's king long term will be in quite some danger, because despite its appearances, it won't be able to castle ever. But what I'd missed, of course, I'd seen that knight e3 was possible, but I thought I was just playing queen b2 check and picking up the rook if this were the case. And it took until actually knight e3 was played on the board before I realized, oh, wait a second, queen b2 check, he just has bishop e2, and the rook covers the other rook. So that was a little bit silly. If I'd noticed that knight e3 was completely possible and a fine move, I might have spent more time on queen b6 check. And if I'd done so, I might have played a better move, which, suggested by the computer, is just knight c5, because there's nothing to gain from this check, really, because the invasions on b2 don't do anything, and it just helps bring white's knight to a better square. So, for example, knight c5, knight e3, bishop e6, this is given by the computer, and it gives already black as having a winning advantage, which in human terms might be a bit much, but this is quite dangerous for black. Black's development flows very naturally. The knight can go to b3, for example. One of the rooks goes to the open files. The queen can still go to b6 to target the king. f5 is still in the picture. And, well, yeah, I'd much prefer to be black here, of course. So, queen b6 check, which is a bad move, because knight e3 is now possible. And actually, I thought my position was still good because I'd missed a second thing. And what I was doing here was I was deciding between queen b2 check, bishop e2, and then bishop e6, or bishop e6 straight away. And I was looking at lines like stuff like queen d3, and I was choosing between knight c5 or rook fd8, both of which are probably very strong, and also like queen here, and I was trying to figure out what the best way to punish white was. And I was also looking at queen b2 check, bishop e2, and then like bishop e6, and if queen a4, then knight c5, if queen d1, then rook to the open file, if queen d3, either rook fd8 or knight c5, and I was gaining a bunch of tempi on the queen to get all my pieces into play. But of course, in both lines, I'd missed one very simple thing, and that is whenever the queen's attacked by bishop e6, it can always go to b5, which just escaped my attention completely. For example, in the game, after bishop e6, shortly after playing it, I realized, wait a second, why haven't I been considering queen b5? It's just clearly the most natural move in the position. and I just didn't see that the b5 square was defended by the bishop, I guess. So after playing bishop e6 and noticing queen b5, I went, oh, well, that's regrettable. I missed that. I should have gone queen b2 check first and only then bishop e6. And it wasn't until after the game that I realized that even if I go queen b2 check first and then bishop e6, queen b5 is still equally possible. So actually the mistake isn't on move 19 with bishop e6, but it's actually on move 18 with queen b6. This is a problem. It allows the knight to get to e3, where it helps secure the black king, and it also allows white to quote-unquote gain a tempo with queen b5. The good thing about black's position, though, is even if you exchange queens, black probably has a slight advantage because of the worse pawn structure of white. But really, by this point, I still wanted to keep queens on the board because the white king is still a target. It hasn't, like, this bishop hasn't moved yet, which means this rook can't move yet, which means this king can't get back into safety and castle by hand. So I played queen c7, which I think is a fine move, and he played c4. And c4 was a move I kind of overlooked / underestimated, and I realized at this point, okay, this isn't going to be so easy, because in all the lines I was looking at, I was just smoothly bringing my pieces into play with tempo. They were all going to sort of huddle around the white king, and I was going to either give mate or both of the isolated pawns were going to fall off the board. But by this point I realized, okay, white is potentially going to land his knight on d5, and potentially it's no longer going to be so clear how exactly I'm going to get at the black king before he has a chance to play, for example, bishop e2, rook hd1, and king g1 and be perfectly safe. Now, my options here, I can play sort of a normal safe move like knight c5, and then after, say, rook d1, play b6, cover the knight. This knight's on quite a good square. It can't be challenged by any of white's pieces very easily. In fact, the knight is the only piece that can reasonably challenge it, and it's quite a distance away. So I saw something like this was possible, but I figured white gets his knight to d5, he gets to consolidate his position. These pawns are weak, but white's reasonably active, and I don't entirely see how to get at these pawns. Objectively, this is probably the best way to play, but by this point I was already sort of tilted at missing queen b5, and I figured, alright, I gotta be more ambitious. White's king is still on f2, why not be more ambitious? And I was also looking at some lines where I was playing like rook f d8, and if knight d5, I was playing queen c5 and swapping queens. And this is probably also okay, just out of curiosity. If I play rook f d8, knight d5, what does it think about this ending? Yeah, this is sort of what I expected. It considers black to be a little better, like minus 0.5 or something to that effect in computer terms. Not all that easy to win, but certainly fairly pleasant to play. But given that before I thought I just had a dominating position, I thought I should be aiming for more, and I made a decision that objectively is quite questionable. Could have worked out sort of poorly, but at the end, based on the final result, I suppose you can say it's justified. I played f5. And shortly after playing this move, I did write in the spectator chat, this is a bad decision and I regret it, or something along those lines. This is quite a standard theme in these lines, well, in general in chess, but also specifically in these f3 Nimzo Indian lines where white parks his king on f2. Black often tries to go for counterplay with f5. And I figured, okay, before white's king can get to safety, I'm going to try to get an attack. And again, it ended up working out reasonably well, but I'm not sure how, positionally well-founded this idea is, because after e takes f5, bishop takes f5, it is no longer so clear who has the better structure, because this e5 pawn is now suddenly isolated and potentially quite a target. In some sort of ending. But of course, black's idea is that he's hoping the game won't reach an ending, and he'll play something like e4, blasting open white's king, and give mate. It's quite an interesting position, and by this point you can see I had 8 minutes left. My opponent still had 24 minutes left, but I managed to sufficiently confuse him with this f5 move that we got. He joined me in the time pressure club. By the way, if he plays bishop d3 instead of e takes f5, trying to keep things closed, I think knight c5 is quite a strong move. So e takes f5, possibly obligatory, and bishop takes f5. And here I was really expecting the move knight takes f5. And what I thought was going to happen was rook takes f5. I thought he would play bishop d3, gain a tempo, and then try to get his rook over and get his king back. I didn't have a clear assessment of this position, and this is the problem with this f5 move, is around this point, I think I said as much in the spectator chat as well, I have no idea what's going on in this position, which is probably a downgrade from before when I was fairly certain I had a small, stable positional advantage. So that's why objectively I don't think this is a great decision, and practically who knows what's going to happen next. Well, I was looking at a few things here. Rook to f4 is one of them. Maybe, well, first of all, maybe with the idea of doubling and pushing e4. Also maybe with the idea of playing something like knight c5, rook d4, and rook a to d8 to harass stuff down the d-file. The computer gives rook h5 at first, which I admit is a move I did not consider at all. But the idea is, well, you're keeping the rook tied down to the h2 pawn because, again, like I said, white wants to develop this rook and bring the king back. And there also might be some ideas of, at some stage, playing e4 and rook takes h2, but you have to be careful with e4 because the queen might take the rook. But if you preface this with some move that covers the rook, maybe g6, maybe queen f7, then you might be genuinely threatening e4 with great effect. So I really don't know what to make of this position. I was also considering rook f7, maybe then bishop e4 is annoying. Rook f6 probably also possible, maybe even rook b6 and rook b2 can be possible if you do that. Probably, I think what I was planning on playing was rook f4, and I could go deep into this position, but I truly don't know what's going on. And the computer's evaluation fluctuates, understandably. It's a very weird position. I think white is probably just in time to get his king back, but black can also get some pressure on the open files here. And it's not like he's ruined his position strategically either, because this pawn is isolated, but these two pawns are still isolated. This knight manages to finally get into the game, and black is still quite active, even if white's king manages to get to safety. There is also the matter you've weakened your own king along this diagonal. It is truly just a mess. Let me turn on the engine and see what the engine's top line is. Okay, it's got rook he1, which makes sense. Covering the e4 square against any of these e4 pushes. Knight c5, rook a d1, rook d4. This is sort of what I had in mind. At some point, I think white might, not here, but white might start thinking about playing king g1, maybe on the previous turn. But then black might be able to get some pressure here. There's rook a d1, rook d4, queen b1. Now the computer wants me to take on d3 and take on c4, which probably makes sense. Or it says h6, or it says rook h4. Yeah. Again, I'm not sure what's going on here, but according to the computer, the position's about even, which is fair. And again, that makes, objectively speaking, f5 a bad decision if positions in this realm truly are even. There is also rook h5 to examine, which I will fully admit I was not going to play unless, I had sort of, if I spotted this at some point, but I just did not occur in my head. But anyways, none of this came to pass because instead of knight takes f5, he played knight d5, which surprised me, and he played this quite quickly. Just a few seconds, and yeah, I really was expecting taking on f5. If for no other reason than because you get to activate this bishop with tempo, weaken the light square somewhat, and just get another set of pieces off the board when the king is a bit weak. But that's not to say knight d5 is a bad move. It is not a bad move by any means, just that I wasn't expecting it. I played queen to f7, and here he played quite an interesting move, which turned out to be bad, but with a limited amount of time on my clock, it did make me panic because I'd completely overlooked it, and it is quite a clever move. Before we get to that, the computer wants to go bishop e2. And, well, my opponent said he was worried about the advance e4, which I think is fair. I was planning on playing e4, but I think we both just underestimated the fact that white can just play rook h to f1, which does a good job indirectly covering the f3 point. So, like, if you try to just take and go bishop e4, white can just retreat his king to safety, and the rook on f1 defends the f3 point. And now white's just ready to bring his king back, and he should probably be more or less okay, I think. Computer even, like, if you leave it running for a couple seconds, it starts to say that white's even a little bit better. So yeah, bishop e2 again, get the rook out, get the king back. White's not too much better. It's still a complete mess, but yeah. Instead, the line the engine gives is rook a c8 instead, followed by knight c5 and b6, and eventually the rook goes to e8, and then somehow later on in the line h5 and g6 are being played. That's a bit strange, but okay. Yeah, I'll fully admit I was intending to play e4 because I'd completely underestimated rook h to f1. I was looking at like f4 and stuff, and I was trying to play like bishop e6 to undermine the f4 point by taking on d5, and on something like g3 I was looking at g5. But rook h f1, just a simple and solid move. But anyways, instead of bishop e2, I was also looking at something like rook e1, just trying to, like, I'm not sure, get control over the e4 square, attack this pawn. If pushed, then I'm not really sure, but bishop e2 is quite a solid move. In the game, my opponent played c5, which is a fairly visually shocking move. Of course, the first tactical point is that queen takes d5 is very well met. That's an understatement, with bishop c4. Pinning and winning, which would be unfortunate. Therefore, you shouldn't do that. But this does also kind of destabilize the knight, which is not so great. First of all, actually e4 is quite a good move here. Which, you know, this is obviously like an idea for black in these kinds of positions where you're trying to target the white king. But I didn't think it was very good in this specific one because I thought white would just go bishop c4. And just optically, the pieces on this diagonal, you can only get one of them off the diagonal at a time. So this seemed just quite scary, especially when you have not much time. You just don't want to do this. But the computer, cold-blooded, just says, actually, first of all, bishop e6 is a fine move. But also, even king h8 is just totally fine. To the extent that actually bishop c4 just shouldn't be played. And the computer wants knight e3 instead, but nonetheless, actually after e takes f3, bishop c4, bishop e6, black's attack is quite strong, and the computer gives black a winning advantage. Now, to be fair, the move I played wasn't bad either. I played bishop e6, which has the advantage of, well, it doesn't allow any tricks along this diagonal for the time being. It attacks the knight, so the knight has to move away, and it also opens the f-file for this e4 push to come with more force. He played knight c3. And here, he's got 18 minutes left. I've got 7 minutes left. Eventually, we both get into much worse time trouble coming up. And yeah, this is the part of the game where you have to make moves quickly. And again, the position is still quite strange. White, I assume, is intending to play a move like knight to e4, just to stop black from getting this e4 push in and further opening white's king. So I came up with a move which, at least practically, I think is very good. And objectively, I think it's decent as well. Queen f4. And this is a move I was quite happy with, because it stops white from playing knight e4 because of queen takes e4 winning a piece. And it threatens queen d4 check, forking the king and knight. And also threatening for black to play e4 once again, because the square is covered a second time, and the f-pawn is pinned not only by the queen, but also by the rook on f8 behind it. So my opponent thought for about 5 minutes and then played the move knight e2, which I thought at the time was a mistake, and the computer confirms it's a mistake. We'll get to that in a second. The move I was expecting was rook to d1, just stopping queen d4 check. But I figured I had a decent position, and by decent I had a strong attack after e4. Which is probably true. You can bring the queen back to defend, but at this point black has to pick up the c5 pawn, and now he's got an extra pawn in addition to quite a strong attack, because you still can't take on e4 safely. You can play queen e3, but black is not obliged to trade queens, even though he can, probably. He can play queen f5 and keep the attack going. And after, yeah, say f4, this line's pointed out by the computer, you can play g5 and just keep the fire burning. Keep pouring wood on the fire. All those chess-related cliches. Computer suggests the move queen d3 instead, but once again, you get to pick up the pawn on c5. And after queen e3, well, the benefit for white in this variation is now the queen and the knight are both hit. So black's forced to trade queens, and you end up in this sort of ending where black's a pawn up, and, well, he should be able to win. My technique is a bit questionable, but yeah, black is much better here. So that's objectively the best way for white to go. But obviously it's a little bit disconcerting to have to just admit, okay, I'm going to head for an ending a pawn down. So he played knight e2. Tempo on the queen, stopping any checks on the d4 square. Again, this theme of checks on this diagonal keeps reappearing. I played the move queen d2, which, to be honest, when I played queen f4, I think I'd missed knight e2. But it is kind of fortunate that queen d2 is such a strong move, because it basically freezes white's entire king side, at least for the time being. And white ends up coming back into the game and actually has an okay position later on in the game, and he manages to do so by chasing black's queen away from the second rank and finally unpinning his knight and freeing his king side, because at the moment the king doesn't have any particularly good to go, because g3 isn't a good square, and if you go to e1, queen e3 is mate. Therefore, this knight is pinned for the foreseeable future. Therefore, the bishop is stuck on f1 for the foreseeable future. Therefore, the rook can't get out for the foreseeable future. Therefore, castling by hand is not going to happen in the foreseeable future. And at the moment, there's no easy way to kick the queen out. Computer wants rook b1, preparing to bring the rook up. My opponent instead... so rook b1. Computer wants queen d5 here. I'm not sure that's what I would have played. I think e4 is what I would have done. Just go ahead with the attack. On queen b2, you do have to bring the queen back, but the attack is still rather strong. Also, rook a c8 is quite possible, planning just to take on c5, and the benefit of when you take on c5, you might be threatening to give check here, you might be threatening to give check here, or at least you're probably going to be supporting the e4 advance. So that's still quite good for black. He played the move c6, which the Lead Chess Stockfish gives a question mark, but I think it's the best practical try, because it just creates confusion. I've got 6 minutes left on my clock at this point. Well, you guys can see the clocks on the screen, but it creates confusion for sure, because black has to decide what he wants to do, because, well, e4 is the standard attacking move, but basically you now sort of have to commit to sacrificing your a6 knight, and you kind of have to be sure, because before black was sort of attacking with, what's the expression? He's playing with house money, because he hasn't sacrificed any material anyways. But once you give up the knight on a6, suddenly the stakes are raised significantly. It turns out to be very, very good for black, but it is, something you have to at least expend a little bit of time thinking about. And then you get into more severe time pressure, and then weird things start to happen. So, c6, I played e4. He took on b7, I played rook a e8. And now my opponent came up with sort of an ingenious practical try. It shouldn't be enough to save the game objectively, but ultimately it does sort of get him out of danger, at least temporarily. So it should be pointed out, after queen takes a6, the line that leads to mate, or at least leads to a very good position for black, is e takes f3. There's not much choice for white here, because if b8 queen, you just have f takes e2 check. And actually, well, another line I was looking at was e takes f3 first, but I don't think this works, because after you take here, f takes e2 check, you have queen takes f8 check. But with the rook already on e8, not only does this rook potentially contribute in the attack, but it also blocks the potential new queen from being able to capture on f8. So queen takes a6, yeah, g takes f3, g takes f3, I mean, otherwise black just takes on e2. You still can't run away because of queen e3, or actually in this case f2 as well. So you may as well, once you reach this point, you may as well take on f3 and ask black how he's going to checkmate you. And the answer, I think, is rook takes f3 check, king takes f3, rook f8 check, maybe bishop d5 leads to mate as well. Let's get computer confirmation. No, bishop d5 doesn't lead to mate. This was my original intention, but after king g4, I couldn't find mate. And it turns out because there isn't any mate. The evaluation keeps rising. It's now at -8. But okay, the way to checkmate the white king is the way that I was planning. Rook f8, check. And now if you go this way, you don't have king g4, which is kind of important. If you go this way, then queen g5 is mate on the spot. If you go this way, then I think the line is, if you go check here, then there's knight g3, which might actually be okay anyways. But bishop here, I already can't remember what line I looked at. If you go back to g3, then check and bishop e6. And if you go this way, queen h6, king g3, queen g5 once again, king here, bishop e6, king here, queen g5, mate. I might have missed something in that sequence, but anyways, that's mate. The one thing I wasn't sure about was what happens if the king goes this way. Had this position actually arisen on the board, I think I would have noticed that queen d5 check, king e3, rook f3 is mate. But from a distance, it's not always that easy. So I was looking at, like, what was I looking at? Like bishop here check, king here, and then something like rook e8. And if the king steps this way, at worst you have takes and take the queen, or check and take the queen. And on king f5, g6 check, king here, probably most things lead to mate, but h5 or rook e4 check. Okay, h5, yeah, they both lead to mate, but just rook e4 check. If you step onto here, well, okay, if you go king here, then you have check here, here is mate, double check. And if you go to g3, it's the same thing, queen e3 followed by something. Knight f4, you just take it, and if king h3, queen h6 check once again, king g2, rook takes e2 check, king g3, queen g5, king g3, rook e3. Anyways, yeah. So this does lead to mate. I didn't perfectly calculate the whole thing, but okay. I think I did good enough. But my opponent played the move b8 queen instead of taking on a6, which I think is an ingenious practical defense. Because, well, now suddenly, with less than 2 minutes on your clock, you have to make a decision. You can't play e takes f3, I don't think, because suddenly white plays queen 8 takes e8. That's just wonderful notation. Queen 8 takes e8. I love that. And that doesn't work. So you have to decide what piece you want to take with on b8. If rook takes b8, you have to figure out whether after queen takes a6, if it's still mate. Whereas if knight takes b8, you have to figure out what you're doing after queen b4, because now suddenly the queen's position on the second rank can be challenged. And if you're forced off the second rank, then you might not be, your attack might not be so strong. You might not be giving mate at all. In the game I played, knight takes b8. It turns out after rook takes b8, queen takes a6, bishop d5, black's just giving mate. But yeah, in my limited amount of time, I wasn't fast enough to figure it out. So I just went for the quote-unquote safe route with knight takes b8, which is a mistake. Rook takes b8 wins more cleanly. Doesn't allow white any chance to disturb black's queen with his own queen. It does cost a piece, but after bishop d5, mate is coming up. And the important point in that line, actually, or one important point, is that f4 never works because of just rook takes f4, because this knight's pinned. But I played knight takes b8, which allowed him a chance to play queen b4. Now, according to Stockfish, this is still winning for black after he plays the move queen d5. Just keeping an eye on the f3 pawn and not allowing white to take on e4. What I was worried about was knight c3, and I wasn't sure what to do here. You can give check back on d2 and repeat the position once, or you can play queen e5, should be fine, because there's no chance for white to take on e4, because something will hang. Queen takes e4 hangs the knight, knight takes e4 hangs the rook. But rook e1 might be a bit worrying. It's still good for black, but you have to find some things. Or just e3 check, king g1, queen e5. This e3 check idea I was never quite sure about, because it felt like it is diminishing black's potential somewhat to open lines towards the king. But if you're forcing the king back to g1, this rook is sort of in a sorry state. This pass pawn could become dangerous, and even still there might be some sacrifices on f3 or bishop h3 or something to that effect. Or even somehow a pawn sacrifice with e2 and giving check on the diagonal. So queen d5 is objectively the right move here. What ended up happening was, well, I wasn't sure what to play, because queen c2 runs into queen c3, and queen d5 I thought ran into knight c3, and the e-pawn would be taken. That's obviously, now we know that's not correct. But I was down to about 6 seconds, and suddenly I had to make a move. So I just played the move I'd most recently considered, which happened to be queen c2. And just somehow, instinctively, with no time on your clock, it just felt right to maintain the pin for one more move somehow, even though I knew it wasn't going to last too long. It just felt right, even though the decision's completely wrong. He goes queen to c3, and now Actually, the best move is to trade queens, which is a bit sad because black's not even a pawn up in the resulting ending. At least not yet. After queen takes c3, knight takes c3, e takes f3, g takes f3. Black is better, but it's a far cry from the great position he had a few moments ago. So I wanted to keep queens on the board. I played queen a4, still hoping to exploit black's king, but by this point the computer gives the game as equal. He played knight d4, which is a good move, just gently pointing out, okay, I've covered f3, I'm ready to bring my pieces out. Are you sure you're so much better? And actually I was very close to blundering my queen somewhere around these stages, because actually I didn't notice it yet, but I noticed it a bit later on, that white is actually threatening bishop g5, trapping the black queen, which would have been rather bad. I played e takes f3. I think still by this point I was blissfully unaware of bishop b5. It doesn't really work here because of f takes g2, and if king takes g2, bishop d5 check, and otherwise g takes h1 equals queen, of course. He played g takes f3. If knight takes f3, I was looking at some ideas involving like queen h4 check and sacrificing the rook, but none of those I think work. The computer instead gives the line just rook c8, which I think is fair enough, and that shows the problem of removing the knight from d4. You keep white's structure intact, but also you allow the rook to infiltrate on c2, because there's no knight on d4 covering c2 anymore. So g takes f3, probably the correct decision, I think, unless there's somehow a better move. g3 may be possible. But okay, played g takes f3. g3 actually might even be the best move. But alright, we're both in mutual severe time pressure. So I'm not gonna, criticize the next moves too much. Okay, here I played rook c8. Computer wants bishop d5 instead. That was part of my plans, but okay. Rook c8. The problem with rook c8 straight away is actually a move I mentioned before. Bishop b5. Instead of queen b4, which he played, bishop b5 actually forces the queens off. This bishop is hit, so you don't really have time to create a fork here. So bishop here, and now rook hc1, and white's managing to simplify the position, and his king is not getting mated for the time being. Black does have a marginally better pawn structure, so he still should maybe be slightly for preference, but it's not really that much anymore. So instead of rook c8 allowing bishop b5, the computer wants bishop d5, but the problem was, by this point I'd noticed bishop b5, and I thought, okay, if I go here, he has bishop b5. But actually, I'd seen rook takes f3, but I didn't have enough time on my clock to actually figure out whether this was worthwhile, because after knight takes f3, the point is queen takes b5, the queen's no longer trapped. White's king is more exposed than it was before, but white's got an exchange for a pawn. Ultimately, the computer says this is worthwhile, but yeah, it's difficult to judge in such a little time. Rook f8 is a threat. Looking at it on the board now, this does look quite scary for white, but okay. I went for rook c8. Here white should play bishop b5 to get queens off the board. He played queen b4, again with not much time on the clock. I played queen d7. He played rook e1. Once again, white should play bishop b5. And here I played bishop d5. Black should play knight c6 instead, according to Stockfish. But okay, this plan looked like quite dangerous to me. Basically, you attack the f3 point with everything you can muster. And a forthcoming idea is queen g4. When this point starts to become quite vulnerable, and as the computer mentions, another idea is knight c6, to try to forcibly trade off this knight, which is one of the key and one of the only defenders at the moment, in fact, of the key f3 point. He played queen to e7, which is a mistake. Instead, the computer wants rook to e7, which it says it's best met by queen d8. I was planning to play queen g4 here, and I'm sort of curious. I haven't checked this yet. What's wrong with queen g4? Rook takes g7. Wow. Well, I thought this didn't work, because... Oh, queen g7, rook e8. Rook g1. And king takes g7, rook g1. I just completely missed rook takes g7. Maybe I would have noticed this in time, maybe not, but queen g4 actually loses. And you have to play queen d8 instead. Yeah, so he played queen e7, and he said after the game that he just missed queen g4, which, fair enough. And yeah, here, the best move for white is, yeah, now just to give up a rook. But this is obviously lost for white. So he tried to defend e3 with queen e3. Because the problem is that, well, the knight's hit on d4, as well as the pawn on f3. And this is one of the main issues with playing queen to e7, is it leaves the knight on d4 undefended, which makes this double threat very difficult to meet. Of course, the threat on f3 is rook takes f3, probably among other things. Knight takes f3, queen takes f3 check, king to g1, and now queen takes h1 check. And probably mate is coming soon too, but at the very least you've won material. And yeah, now you don't really have bishop g2 or bishop e2 as a defense because the knight on d4 hangs with check. So he played queen e3. Now maybe rook c2 check is strong, but rook c to e8 I think is good enough. Yeah. And now, well, if you play queen to d3, then you just have queen h4 check. Yeah, and that just ends the game, essentially, because the rook on e1 is skewered, and mate may well follow. So he played queen takes e8, queen takes d4 check, and now, yeah, if queen to e3, then rook takes f3 check. And yeah, white's dropping even more material than it seems at first sight, because there's just nowhere for the king to go that's particularly convenient, and black will just win. King to g3, queen to f4 check, and now he resigned. You can pick up f3 with check first. You can take the queen. You can even just take the queen and argue, okay, now my knight on b8 is defended, so I'm just up massive amounts of material. Or you can take on f3, take, and play king f7, and argue that both rooks are forked. Either way, yeah, white resigned here. So, alright, let's do a quick recap of what happened in this game. So, yeah. We followed theory for a little bit. Knight e2 was somewhat inaccurate, and white made a slightly strange decision to give up his bishop on e3, which I think made life difficult for him over the forthcoming moves. Knight a6 was objectively not the best decision, because after bishop takes a6, b takes a6, black is sort of hinging on a direct attack, which doesn't necessarily work, because he's acquiescing to compromising his structure. On queen to c4, black shouldn't throw in queen b6 check, which I did just because I'd missed that queen b5 was possible. And here, objectively, the best decision is just to try to consolidate with either knight c5 or rook fd8, knight d5, queen c5 check, or something in that vein, just to try to get a nice position where you can try to win a long game where white's pawns over here are weak. But instead I decided to mix it up with f5, which eventually was justified, but objectively shouldn't have been. c5 was a tricky move, which didn't turn out so well. And I managed to tie up white's kingside here, but did let him back into the game when I didn't manage to accurately calculate the consequences of rook takes b8, which wins the game with a direct attack, but instead had to go for knight takes b8. But instead ended up going for knight takes b8, which allowed white to... And now queen c2 was a time trouble decision that just worked out very poorly, because the queen is chased back, and now suddenly white is very much back into the game. And here white missed his chance to reach a more or less even ending with bishop to b5. But again, in time trouble, your queen's attacked, you move it. I think he said in the chat after the game that he was strongly considering playing bishop b5, but just couldn't quite bring himself to do it. And ultimately, actually, white was still very much in the game even as late as this, because after rook e7 I was intending queen g4, completely missing that rook takes g7 actually turns the tables for white. Queen d8 still preserves the advantage, possibly the win for black, but white still in mutual time scramble in such a complicated position. There are always chances, and yeah, queen e7 was a mistake, and eventually did manage to win the game, but quite an intense game. And yeah, one that certainly could have been played better by both sides, but nonetheless, quite a fun game. All right, so that's all for today. See ya.